because I'm like, I don't really want to talk about that.
I know. I don't either. I'm already doing the hand wringing.
Yeah, I'm like, I don't. This is not a comfortable topic. I'm like, can't we talk about like flowers or something?
That's so not even you.
But I'm growing plants. They're actually growing.
uh,
Okay.
yes, spiritual growth, but specifically talking about vulnerability in your practice and how not being vulnerable can get in your way. And also understanding, I think, the difference between being vulnerable, oversharing, not, having boundaries. I think there's a bunch.
Okay. All right, let's do it then.
Okay.
All right.
I wish y'all could see Isabel's face right now.
I'm all for coaching people on this.
I know.
When you're like, let's talk about it. And I'm like, okay, I guess so. I don't know what to say.
So we teach what we need to learn.
Yeah, I guess we do. All right, guys, welcome to Motherland. All right.
Today we're talking about vulnerability, which is kind of funny because Isabel and I are such strong women. And I think being strong, it can be hard, challenging to be vulnerable. It's something I've struggled with my whole life. I don't know about you.
I was raised by my mom, who just was raised by her father. So there was no understanding of vulnerability. You push that stuff down. You don't talk about things. It's just no. There was no understanding of it. So I had to really learn how to navigate that. And I think when I learned how to navigate it, I learned how to navigate it without boundaries.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think a lot of us don't know how to really be vulnerable in a healthy way.
Yes. Let me ask you this question, because vulnerability was not something that I was raised with either. In fact, it was just the opposite. And I am actually an expressive person, and I do want to share. But then when I did, I was told that I was being too much or I was being too sensitive. And my question is do you think for BIPOC folks or immigrant kids, there's sort of this harder shell culturally around showing things because were they trying to protect us from the world?
I think what you're saying, yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. I don't know if it was more of a state, like I go generations back into this, right? Like I go into the state that my grandfather didn't let his weaknesses or anything of pain or his heart in a way show through, because then you just don't do that, right? You don't show that, especially because he's worked so hard in his life to fit in, to fit in. And I think my mom by nature just took that on, even though that wasn't her understanding of it at the time. And so I think we just kind of take it on in our own way. And I think as I've grown up, my story is totally different than my mother's, where like I did have things that was like, I wasn't going to allow myself to be vulnerable because again, right, there's that shell, you got to fit in, you got to do better, right? My mom, that was one of the things I was always taught, do better. If somebody's attacking you, then be better. And not be better in the sense of, because you're not worthy, but be better to showcase you can't attack me, right? I'm smart or I'm intelligent or I'm athletic or whatever it is. So yeah, I think absolutely.
Yeah, I think very similar. And I wonder if I actually think it might even just be, it's unconscious on some levels. I think it's generational and it's handed down. And I think in some ways, maybe my parents thought that they were protecting me from the outside world so I could be tough and resilient and deal with, stuff as it came at me. But it's something that I still struggle with.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because doing this work that I do, it could appear that I'm very vulnerable, right? Like because of the work that I do and, and I'm digging so much or holding space or all of these different things. I think I used to fool myself that I was being vulnerable when I wasn't actually. Um, just because I'm meditating and just because I'm studying and doing all of these things and connecting with spirit and guides and my ancestors, if I am still not breaking my heart open sometimes to things that I need to sort of look at, I am not being vulnerable. But I think it's easy to fake when you're doing this kind of work.
I think people fake it all the time.
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
people are constantly faking it. I mean, we've talked about that in a previous podcast where it's like the woundedness has become um, a condition to show that like I'm doing
Yeah.
spiritual work, and it's like, no, that's not the way. That's not the way that it works.
Mhm.
I'm actually like, it's funny, look at me stuttering. Oneika was like, let's do this topic. And I'm like, I'm still really uncomfortable with the topic. Like I said, even though I teach people and I tell people to, um, I think I want to explain a little bit about what vulnerability is, because I don't
Okay.
understand what it is. Vulnerability, in the sense that we're talking about, is allowing yourself to, I hear my guides talking, allowing yourself to show emotion in a way that is not, I love this, that is not harmful to yourself or to others in a way. And it's allowing your weaknesses to be seen or known, but I don't like the word of saying they're my weaknesses. I want to say
Mhm.
it's more of like allowing your heart to be shown, right? Allowing your
Mhm.
emotions, allowing your opinion, allowing your thoughts to be open with others in a way.
Mhm.
We're so used to, like, if we don't like something, like we talked about right now, like bottling up. If we don't agree with something, we bottle it up, right? We don't show the pain that maybe somebody hurt us with or things like that. But we open this by showing it. We allow ourselves to open to discussion and to growth rather than bottling up. Which I'm not going to go into, but it goes into the whole shadow side. Don't bottle it, and then you're allowed to express it, heal it, move through it, and grow from it.
Mhm.
But being vulnerable when you first are so used to, when you're conditioned to a way, like we said, you're conditioned to not show emotions, to not talk about these things of what people deem weaknesses or certain things. And then now you're reconditioning yourself in a way of saying, I need to talk about this. I need to express these things. It's
Mhm.
scary.
Yeah. I I think of it as all of that, like this idea of defenses being down and open and exposed with the potential of being harmed because you are purposely just allowing yourself to be open. There's this really great Peter Gabriel song called Red Rain.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there's this one line and he says, I come to you defenses down with the trust of a giant,
Mm.
which is so interesting. And I remember hearing this song in high school and it really struck me. And I think because, I'm a teenager and vulnerability and you're trying to figure out who you are. And I remember hearing that line, and it can be interpreted two different ways. It
Mm-hmm.
could be defenses down with the trust of a giant, that you feel so big that you're not really trusting, right? So you could be protected. Or you could be so vulnerable and allowing yourself to be so open, that you're allowing yourself to trust that much.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea, I used to think that vulnerability was weakness.
Yep.
I thought that vulnerability was vulnerability and love were almost synonymous to me. So I equated, or I don't want to say equated. I think I conflated my vulnerability with love. So to love someone is to be vulnerable, and that's definitely an aspect to it. But I was also programmed to make sure that I was always taking care of myself. And I'm
Right.
using air quotes there because I don't think it really meant that. It was building a wall. Um, and it was something I didn't want to let anybody in for
Well, it's really
a long
interesting because
time.
I think, as you're talking, it's like you said something right now at the beginning. I was like, well, that's because we look at feeling to feel, like allowing ourselves to feel is to be vulnerable, right? And then we're taught that we're not, that feeling is a weakness, that we're not really supposed to feel,
Mm-hmm.
right? So you have to look at the sense of, like, in your feelings, right? Where do you distinguish these feelings as being bad? And it goes into like, okay, we've learned that our feelings are bad in a way.
Mm-hmm. And And I like what you said earlier when we first started talking about the idea that if being vulnerable isn't something that you do regularly, you can open yourself up to being too open
Mhm.
and being open in situations when you should have a little bit of a guard up.
Mhm.
And we sort of expose ourselves over and over again to perhaps to folks who don't deserve our vulnerability,
Right.
right? Who aren't worthy of our trust. And we're so eager once we start to taste it. And that happened to me. Once I opened up and I was like, oh, this feels good because I feel whole. And then I was just kind of doing it all of the time. I'm thinking of like my 20s when I was just like, you
Dumping
know,
everything out, just dumping.
yeah, on everybody, everywhere,
Yeah.
any moment. And it was really messy. And I was really messy. And then I was like very angry a lot because it's like, well, I showed you my heart and you hurt me. And it's like, well, that person was a dick and maybe you shouldn't have. And it's like this balance. It's like you have to learn how to, what, when is it appropriate? I'm not even going to, I was going to use the word safe and then I stopped myself. When's it appropriate to expose that and for what reason and under what circumstances? And what do you hope to come of that? And all of those things I think are really important and a big part of my practice.
Yeah. Well, when do you think that vulnerability is important?
I think in my intimate relationships and not just romantic, I think platonic, I think family relationships. It can be important if I feel like I'm not being heard
Mhm.
or there's something that I want to share. And I want to do that because I feel like it's necessary for our relationship to grow or heal.
Mhm.
That something is said. And I think it's important that being vulnerable also is not a reason to shout your vulnerability at somebody, right? Just because we've had trauma and then we learn to be vulnerable, it's not an excuse to sort of just
Well, that's
verbally attack when you're
right.
being vulnerable, you know? And I think that's important too.
Yeah. Yeah, that's anger though. Anger is a different emotion than the other ones. I think that goes underlying, right? Anger is not the same as vulnerability.
No, but I think there are relationships that I have had, and I'm only speaking from an I experience with my anger and my fear and my vulnerability, right? So there are times that they would get intertwined
Definitely.
because I being vulnerable and an old story would come up around the vulnerability, and that's going to the shadow work, so we won't go too deep into that. But learning how to navigate that, and that's the sort of going to the other extreme, right? I'm going to be vulnerable, but I'm going to try to protect myself at the same time because I don't know how to do it yet.
Hmm. Hmm. It's interesting. I'm sitting here and there's all these thoughts coming to me as like I'm listening to you talk. And I know originally I was like, hey, last couple times we've talked, I was like, let's just do, I've been wanting for some reason to talk about love. But as I'm even sitting here, and I'm thinking of all the ways that we need to show or be vulnerable, right? Is in that sense too. I'm like looking at it as love, like love. In order to really love, I think, or to be open to love, you have to allow yourself to be vulnerable.
Mm-hmm.
You have to allow yourself to be exposed.
I've been exploring a lot of vulnerability in my friendships over the past few years, which I'm really enjoying and appreciating. I think I used to also just associate vulnerability with romantic love.
Hmm.
Um, and I have a few really dear friends who I can be my whole and complete self with.
Hmm.
And that's really powerful when you can be with somebody. It's not necessarily your partner, but you can be your whole self, and let yourself be seen that way. Um, it's incredibly transformative.
Yeah. I think for anyone that, for the listeners, it's in the sense that the other part too, and when you're learning to be vulnerable, is we have to be vulnerable with ourselves first.
Hmm.
Right? We have to be willing to look at things that are uncomfortable or to acknowledge our own feelings and our emotions, rather than what we've done this whole time, which is ignoring or walking away.
Hmm. How do you practice that, or how did you practice that?
Oh,
What
I
are
feel
some
like
ways?
I feel like the universe with me in practicing that just like pushes me so hard till you're like, I surrender. I can't do this anymore.
Uh-huh.
Like I always tell people, I'm like, your spirit team, your guides, what universe creator, whatever you want to say it, like everybody has a different way of communicating, right? We all have a different way of communicating with those essences of us. And in a sense, some are real gentle, some are whispers, some are, we're going to guide you. Mine aren't. Mine are like, we're going to dump everything out at you until you finally get the hint. So for me, what I really had to do, um, I'm kind of tapping in right now as I'm trying to see how to explain this. I learned to listen. I had to learn to listen to myself and really listen. That meant that I had to make it a practice where I escaped the noise and just allowed myself to listen and acknowledge when something was painful, when something hurt, when something made me uncomfortable. I had to learn to listen why also that I accepted certain things. Why did you accept that? Why did you allow that? Why did you think you needed that? Because in some aspect of us, we think we need things or we just allowed things. So I had to learn to listen and journal in a way. I did a lot of journaling for my own self-expression and to say like, this hurt or I didn't like this and this is what it made me feel like.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really key, I think, on how I learned how to be vulnerable with myself. I think, we do those practices and then you're kind of like, well, then what? Right?
Mm-hmm.
We're like, well, then what? I think that's why we do these practices. And when you get to the point of asking yourself, then what? That's where you make decisions of, it goes into a different place. Are these relationships healthy? Are they a place that, help you to grow or
Yeah.
help you to be a better version of you in some sense way? Like, because vulnerability takes courage. It takes a lot of strength, to be vulnerable with yourself and yes, to be vulnerable with others. And if somebody's not going to value that or return that in some shape, way, or form, then those are things to be questioned. What I find interesting is how many people do not know how to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
No, it's not something they've ever allowed themselves to be. And even as we got onto this podcast, you saw me kind of crawling in my skin. It's that way for a lot of people all the time. You crawl in it's like, I don't want to do this. This is not what I was trained to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that's kind of how I learned. I just had to learn to listen and acknowledge. And I think it's really hard to listen to ourselves. I think it's
Mm-hmm.
really hard to really listen and to say either I screwed up or I am screwed up because of whatever reason, and these are the things. It's hard.
Yeah.
It's hard. I had a situation. It's funny. We had a situation recently. I don't even know if I know my boyfriend listens to the podcast, so I'm kind of like okay. And speaking of being vulnerable right now. So we had a situation where there was a circumstance where we were camping and,
Mm-hmm.
he wanted to invite his family. We've been together for 4 years and he's like, I want to invite my family and merger. I want them to meet and I want your family to meet my family. And I wasn't ready in some sense because I've been married and the last person that met my family were my in-laws 20 something years ago. And I had to allow myself a sense of vulnerability that to say, hey, here's my feelings. Here's the reason why. Here's why I feel like I'm not ready. I need you to understand. And it's scary. I don't think people think like, oh, you can just say these things and you're being mean or hurtful or it's not nice. But, on my side, I was really scared. I was like, this is really, really hard for me to express why, even though you may not understand or agree. I have to
Mm-hmm.
tell you why rather than just saying, oh, okay, that's fine. I'll suck it up and deal with it when inside of me was like, I'm not ready and I'm incredibly uncomfortable right now.
Yeah. I think you said something so important that I would like to just emphasize and underline that vulnerability is not always opening up and saying yes to something. It's just the idea of opening up and saying what's on your heart, and even not knowing what the answer might be or how somebody might receive what you're saying. And vulnerability can be, I need to share this, and it's something that I don't want to do. And it's not always like, oh, I need to be vulnerable and say yes to everything. Like, I don't think that's it. And I think toxic wellness sort of gets into that. Be vulnerable and say yes to everything, which can be really foolish and dangerous. And it does it. It takes a lot of practice. I had to physically get inside my body to learn how to be vulnerable. When I know now, when I'm not being vulnerable, I get a sense of tightness around my diaphragm. It's like a sucking in, like somebody's pulling a corset around my waist, that tightness. Mm-hmm. And I can even feel right before the tightness that it's coming. And that's when I know that I am not maybe saying something that I want to say, or I am not responding in a way that is in alignment with my whole self. Mm-hmm. And I learned how to recognize that more regularly and to be able to manage it with a sense of, I think, tenderness and grace through my physical asana practice. Like when I'm on my mat and I would do a pose that I didn't know how to do, quote unquote, well. My frustration at myself, my anger at myself, all of these things would close. I could recognize the way that I'm talking to myself on my mat during my yoga practice speaks volumes to the way that I am talking and seen in the world. So that became a really nice way for me to check in. Like if I was doing my asana practice and I felt really in alignment, and, even if things were frustrating, I was okay with that. And I would just allow things to be there without trying to have them be different than they were. That's when I could really know that I was sort of in flow with life. Mm-hmm. But when I found myself judging other people or judging myself or getting angry with the teacher, I know I'm blocked off to myself. Mm-hmm. And that indicates that there could be something going on that I need to investigate.
Yeah, that's a good way.
Yeah. And that's, we all have different, we all have our different ways. Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it still was what I was saying. You're still listening. You're listening to the way that you're communicating with yourself. You're listening to the words, and you're listening to your body, and you're listening to mm-hmm. everything else in that sense mm-hmm. of, listening. I don't know. I'm just thinking how people. I think when I learned to be vulnerable, how many people chose to not be a part of that. Like how many people that you're like, we were talking, how many friendships change or your relationships change. And when we choose to be vulnerable, like I said, it makes people uncomfortable, but people will choose to not want to be a part of that. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think when we said it, like, how does vulnerability affect your spiritual practice? What do you think?
I think, it's allowed me to explore my connection with spirit and with my ancestors more deeply. It's allowed me to, mm-hmm. I think, learn how to pray, which was not something I grew up with. And even me saying the word pray out loud.
I kind of was like, oh.
I felt myself get tight because I think this was something I had always wanted to do, like to see, now I'm doing the stuttering. Like to be able to talk out loud and have conversations with spirit or the universe or God or whatever. Being vulnerable allowed me to do that. Mm-hmm. And it was freeing. I'm getting a lump in my throat even talking about it. It was really freeing because I think it was in those moments that I'm like, I'm just really myself right now. I'm just really myself here with the universe. And it's terrifying and beautiful at the same time. And I think it's been an instrumental part of my practice. I think vulnerability even led me down the path to a spiritual practice.
Yeah. Yeah. I think my job makes me vulnerable. Like, I know it does. Like, I run my own business. I have to
Mm-hmm.
provide with it. There is a sense of like, and I'm very open and honest with my stories and how it is. I love that there is, as I ask that question, you know, I think if you guys don't know, Brene Brown speaks about vulnerability. That's her key thing. Like, that's what she speaks about.
Yeah.
And she has a thing, or she makes a comment on vulnerability is the birthplace of love, belonging, joy, courage, and creativity. It is the source of hope, empathy, accountability, and authenticity, right? So if we want that greater clarity, purpose into our spiritual lives, into just your life in general, however it is, then you at some point have to allow yourself to be vulnerable.
Yeah, and I think as a Black woman, that was not something I could do very easily all of the time, right? Because, there's this trope of the angry Black woman, and it's not an angry Black woman. It's all the stress that you end up carrying and all the I think the narratives that people have about your existence. And being vulnerable is something that I had longed to do, just to say, like, my heart needs a break. Like, I need somebody to see me. I need to rest. I need somebody to give me a hug. And it wasn't something I could always do. I think about it now and it makes me emotional because it's it's been such a long journey to be able to do that. And now that I can do it, I feel so relieved. And I think a part of me still wants to, like, put my arms around that younger woman who felt like the only way that she could show up in the world successfully was to be like with armor, with this with this armor that I'm not going to let anything get into me. And the potential opportunities that were lost to grow and change. And I know that things are what they are. We're on our path, but I mourned that a little bit. Like, what things could have been different, and you have to let that go. But I think it's still important to be able to mourn um, the fact that I felt like I needed to be so hard. And I'm grateful now that I don't feel that way, and that I have allowed softness to come into my life. And it takes a lot of work, and I wouldn't have it any other way. Um, but it does feel dangerous. It does, you know.
How did your family respond to this version of you?
I think I think my sister and, like, my aunt, I think, are really proud. I don't know if everybody always gets it.
Yeah.
I don't think my mom always gets it. Um, I think she thinks I'm talking mumbo jumbo sometimes when I might be talking about things that might be, she's feeling a little bit, that she's connecting with and has a wall up. But I think for the most part, I think people do respond to me differently.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've let friends go
Yeah.
because I realized that harder version of myself was no longer it was compatible in that version of a relationship, but this version wasn't.
Yeah. I had a situation this weekend. I always have situations with my family. My family does not respond to vulnerability. They do not. I mean, they just don't. It's. Yes, I'm vulnerable. I talk, which they may say, you talk too much about your feelings and your emotions. And then this weekend we had a situation where my mom crossed the line, as she does often. And I told her, like, and her response was, "You're just too sensitive." And I'm just like, no. And I said, "You're mean." And I said, "You're mean." And she goes, "Well," I said, "and it's not nice to call people sensitive, by the way." Of course, my mom's comeback was, "It's not nice to call people mean." And I was like, "Well, don't be mean." But the point is that my family does not respond to me. They're so opposite of me. They're still very much, you take what you receive from others regardless of your feelings in return, and you just take it. That's it. You don't say anything back. You just deal with it.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, no, I'm not going to deal with it. I don't need to be a dumping block for you in any
Yep.
shape, way, or form. And I'm going to speak up when you cross the line.
Talk
And it's
about it.
so funny. It's like her response was, in my day when I was a child, even if my father said something wrong to me, doesn't matter. You don't say anything back.
Yeah.
I was like, that's great for you. That does not work for me. Like, at
Mm-hmm.
the end of the day, I'm like, I am a woman with a family. Like, no, that doesn't work. So I just asked that, how does your family respond? Because mine does not respond. They do
Yeah,
not.
there was a lot of shutdown
Mhm.
when I was growing up. That was the way that people dealt with things. It was to shut down and to freeze out and to ice out, which I find incredibly hurtful and incredibly painful, to pretend that somebody isn't there. Um, and I think that also shaped a lot of my inability for a long time to be vulnerable, because there was a sense of, oh, people take their love away. When I show my whole self, people snatch it away. And then there's that primal instinct of wanting to no, like, don't leave me kind of thing.
Mhm.
Um, and that's where I think boundaries also become important as you start to learn
I
to
was
be
just thinking
vulnerable.
that right now because I was like,
Yeah,
some people that are just not, that don't deserve our vulnerability.
exactly.
There's some people that just don't deserve our vulnerability,
Yep.
and I think we come in this way where we want to talk or we want to share, we want to be open, but some people just don't deserve it,
Yeah.
you know? And there's a lot of different traits I think we can look at of those people that don't. I mean,
Hmm.
it's like we said, it's going to make somebody uncomfortable. So if somebody's struggling in their own ways of expressing their own emotions or their own faults,
Hmm.
definitely probably somebody that's not ready or undeserving of it in some way.
Yes.
I think of my mom in some sense, they apologize, but they don't necessarily change or change their behavior
Hmm.
at times.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, there's a lot of things, blaming others. Yeah, blaming others or I don't know. Yeah.
When I was at Rikers, being vulnerable was not something that you could really do in jail, right? Like,
Oh, yeah.
because physically you could get hurt being vulnerable.
Yeah.
But I do think that my office was one of those places where folks could be vulnerable, because they knew it would just be there. And again, I want to make this very clear. It's not because I created a safe space, because I don't believe I could create a safe space at Rikers just by virtue of the environment, and there are no such thing as safe spaces anyway. But I think what I could do was be there for folks without judgment and just listen. And that allows people to slowly experiment with their vulnerability.
Mhm.
And I think bearing witness to some beautiful things that I saw with people, like learning how to do that, was also a teaching moment for me. And also learning how to receive other people's vulnerability. We've been talking a lot about us being vulnerable with other people, but there's also learning how to practice when other people are vulnerable with you, especially, again, if it's their first time learning how to be vulnerable and maybe it's clumsy or whatever, or really learning how to listen, as Isabel has, I think, so been beautifully saying. So recognizing that somebody exposing themselves is really terrifying, and how we respond to that is incredibly important and can really shape how somebody could move going forward. And I think it's a responsibility that we have to others as humans.
Mhm. Mhm. No, I definitely agree. I mean, it's taken me work, and it sounds weird saying it, but training in order.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I had to go through training and learn how to like respond,
Yeah.
sharing without judgment, without
Mhm.
ego, without anything, to just learn how to respond to people in the things that you just are listening, allowing them to share and be open and honest in those sense of things.
Mhm. And not making it about you,
Yeah.
which is easy to do with like clients and students, and harder to do with family and, partners, because there's all that stuff there. But it is really, it's a skill.
Yeah.
I think you're right. It's a skill and it takes practice. And I think people sometimes, not people, let me again speak from I think I used to think it was something that was just automatic. So I just needed to know how to do it. And didn't appreciate that this was something that I could learn how to build. And I was somebody who I could pick up something very quickly and be very good at it, and then that was just it. But then if I fumbled with things, that frustration would turn me off so much that I would want to just abandon it and walk away, because that discomfort, I think, also ties in with vulnerability. Learning how to be uncomfortable when you're practicing being vulnerable
Oh
is
yeah,
incredibly important,
definitely.
because you're living in a place of discomfort.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's huge. You have to learn how to be. Let's always say there's always growth in uncomfortability.
Hmm.
There's always growth in uncomfortability.
Yeah, that's that teacher that I mentioned who said you can change or be comfortable, but you can't do both at the same time. I mean,
Yeah, not.
if that wasn't divine intervention, I don't know what is. Like, it was like a lightning rod moment in my life. I heard what I needed to hear at the exact moment that I needed to hear it for it to shift everything underneath me.
Yeah, our life, our passion, our purpose. Like, I always ask people, like, who told you it was supposed to be comfortable? Who told you
Hmm.
it was supposed to be easy? Like,
Hmm.
I'm like, that's not necessarily true.
Hmm.
Me feeling my passion and my purpose, like, and I'm not saying this to manifest this in a way, but does not mean it's necessarily always smooth and perfect
Yeah.
and that doesn't mean though that it's wrong,
Mhm.
but who told you these things, right? I think that when you're aligned, and even that word, I was talking about this last night, I was like, I hate the word aligned, because I think people think aligning or alignment is a sense of how everything just goes so smoothly.
Oh
And I'm
no.
like, that is not what that means.
No, that's not what that means at all.
Yeah, and I'm like, that is such the wrong. Like, I've how many times have you heard if things are hard or rough, then you're not in alignment? And I'm like, that's not true at all.
I
And
mean that things are lined up the way that they're supposed to be lined up in that moment, but that doesn't necessarily mean it feels good.
no, and I think that's the thing, going back into growth and being vulnerable. And I say that because even in my passion and my purpose in growing, I'm constantly growing, I'm constantly evolving. There's constant measures of uncomfortability that come in or pushing me in some way to be okay. Let's explore this. Let's grow. Let's do this. Let's
Mhm.
move forward. And yeah, I'm in alignment. I'm going to use it in the sense that I'm in alignment. Very much know this is what I meant to do in my life.
Yeah.
Does not mean that it is without uncomfortability at all. I literally tell people, I'm like, look, there's a thing between, I think, I don't know how we want to work this in, but there's a thing between fear and being vulnerable. So when I feel myself in the sense of what I think is fear, is not myself being fearful of things. It's myself being fearful of the vulnerability aspect.
Absolutely.
And that's where it's like, I think people go, well, oh, fear stops us. And I'm like, is it fear? Or is it because you're being called to be vulnerable, to reflect, to heal, to look at, or to open up a door? So I've learned that when I feel this, literally, like when this comes up, it's not time for me to stop, but it's time for me to push. Like, okay, let's push forward even more so.
Mhm.
But yeah, it's not, I don't know.
You know, yes, you're talking about something that I think, you know, in the trauma informed world of like mindfulness and yoga and all of that, there, when you first started hearing folks talking about it, it was always this idea of softness and rest, and and that is necessary sometimes to rest to heal. And what I didn't see happening, which used to really frustrate me, particularly when I was working in a jail setting, was that everything was all about rest and softness, and nothing was about being uncomfortable and allowing yourself to grow. And I feel like if we only allow ourselves to hang out in this softness, we are actually, especially as practitioners, whether it's a coach or a teacher, allowing, I think we do our students and clients a disservice
Yeah.
when we don't talk about the discipline that's necessary around your practice and around learning how to be comfortable being uncomfortable. And it infantilizes people, and I think it makes people more helpless. to their own experience, and thinking that only something external can drive them forward, rather than understanding sometimes you need to rest. Sometimes you need to move forward. The only way you know how to do which when, is by learning to understand yourself and knowing yourself and listening to yourself. And that takes practice, and that takes skill, and that takes mistakes, and you'll fuck up and you'll do stuff wrong, you'll do stuff right, but you can't allow those things to hinder your ability to stay connected with yourself and with spirit.
Yeah. It's interesting because I'm listening to you and I'm like, because I always hear my little guides chirping in the background, and I'm sorry, I'm just laughing because I'm thinking somebody's literally going to think my guides chirp. They don't chirp, I mean talk. But my point is that I'm listening to you and you're talking about the sense of, this wellness and how they want to, have ease and relaxing and all this. And then I'm like, there's such two different sides, right? I feel like that's the thing with vulnerability. Vulnerability is there to help us to create a balance. It's helping us to create a balance. It's helping us to flow. And I think in this world of wellness, there has been two sides. It's either, right, the rest and the relaxation and the positive and
the bubble baths.
But there's a whole other side too, which I have seen quite often, which drives me nuts, which is the trauma bonding side.
Right. Ugh.
Right. And it's like, let's go into the trauma bonding, because if you're going through trauma bonding, you're having a spiritual awakening, and this is what it's always going to be like. And like, no, it's not meant to be one complete this side or one complete that side. It's this balance. And if it's done correctly, I'll be honest, if it's done correctly and right, yeah, there is times of bliss and there is times of trauma. But at the end of the day, it's all about clearing all of that out just for you to just listen, accept, and move through those feelings and emotions and navigate life with that way. Whether that's in the happy moments or in the sad moments or in the fearful moments, but it's meant for you to grow and to expand and become, like you say, that whole version of yourself.
Yep.
Because you can't be whole if you're not vulnerable. You just
Exactly.
I don't know. But I think for those that listening, if you're like, okay, this is new to me, I do want to encourage you in the sense that, let's say you've been doing this for a while or you're starting this off. I don't think it's always being vulnerable I don't think you get to a point where you're like, this is completely comfortable. Do you agree?
Totally. I totally agree. Absolutely.
Like, oh, I'm being vulnerable and this is I get what I'm experiencing right now and I'm so comfortable. It's like,
absolutely not.
I was like, maybe I'm doing it wrong.
No, absolutely not. And in fact, it always feels icky to me. I think I'm just used to the fact that it feels icky. Like, you know what I mean? That's what I'm used to, is the feeling that way. But it's not that it's just this lovely thing that I do. No, it's challenging as fuck. No.
Yeah.
It took me a long time. Like, building up those walls that I had were there for most of my adult life.
Yeah.
So, this is a lot of unlearning that I'm doing.
There you go. And that's what it is. It is a lot of unlearning. It is a lot of unlearning to learn how to speak up, to learn how to do and acknowledge all of these things that you were told that not to acknowledge, or that you were told was a weakness.
Yeah, it's a problem. Yeah. And I have to I know we're recording, but I think I left a pot on, so hold on so I don't burn my apartment down.
Okay, go. All right. I'm kind of in the sense where I'm like, is there anything else you want to say with vulnerability?
No, I actually, I think I will say this, practicing vulnerability. Isabel talked about Brene Brown. She's written some really interesting things about vulnerability. There's another book that I love that talks about vulnerability. It's called The Way of Tenderness. And it's by Zenju Earthlyn Manuel. She is a Zen priest, I believe. And she is amazing. She's Black and she's queer. And she kind of talks about her emotional journey and dealing with her various identities and also investigating Buddhism, but really what it meant for her own heart and being able to open up to the world. Really, and it's so short. I don't even know if it's 100 pages, but it's just really powerful. I reread it a lot.
Oh, I have to see that one. I have to
Yeah.
see that one. I know we need to make, like, when we do our website, which I'm trying to get my website first, we need to put a book page because we always have giving so many rough
Yeah.
books.
Yeah. But The Way of Tenderness and Brene Brown, which one would
Well,
you say?
Brene Brown does a talk on herself. She has a great talk, a TED talk
Yeah.
on power vulnerability. Just listening to
Yes.
yeah, she has a lot of different. I mean, this is what she talks about. So there's a lot out there that you can look at.
Dare to Be Great. I loved. I actually did read Dare to Be Great.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That Dare to Be Great was really good. I did read that one. I think when you guys are looking at being vulnerable, I want to say this. Besides being compassionate with yourself, right? I don't. It's funny. I talked about this last night too. Allowing yourself to give up on perfection.
Mm.
Allowing
Say
your,
that again for the people.
allowing yourself to give up on perfection. Yeah, that's a big one when it comes to vulnerability.
Mm-hmm.
So just want to encourage, as you guys are, and as you guys are learning to be in the moment with your feelings and your emotions and listening and acknowledge, it's okay for you to slow down. It's okay for you to take your time. And it's okay for you not to listen to other people's opinions of you or your circumstance or what you're doing. Yeah, but I think that's the thing is, like, being vulnerable means that, you do have to vocalize. Maybe you don't have to vocalize to everybody, and maybe you don't even have to vocalize to the person that wounded you at times, but you do have to vocalize to yourself.
Yeah.
And that's the key thing, is vocalizing and being honest with yourself.
Mm-hmm. If no one else,
Yeah.
you and you when you go to sleep at night, you know what I mean? Even if there's somebody else in the bed with you, you can't hide from yourself. You can't.
You cannot hide from yourself. I think one of the things that I have become is that, yeah, I can't hide from myself, but I can't hide from others either anymore.
Yeah.
So now that I'm very open and honest, if something irks me, I will tell you, like,
Mm-hmm.
this is not sitting well with me. Does it go well all the time? Absolutely not. But I have to say it.
Yeah. And that's the okay part too, right? This isn't about being vulnerable because you think that things are going to go well, but it's just the whole point of being vulnerable is that you don't know how it's going to go.
Yeah.
The safety is not there.
Yeah. Well, that's where I tell people, you are your safety.
Exactly.
You are your safety.
Yep.
Until you are feeling safe within yourself, then yeah, I don't think you ever really feel right to be like, oh, I can really, do this. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it does. Actually, I'll end on this. A couple weeks ago, I went to a gala.
Yeah.
And it was for masculine identified lesbians of color, right? Like that was sort of, I had spoken they had a conference and I spoke about healing and identity. And then there was a gala, and it was mostly Black lesbians who were in the room, or Black queer women, because not everybody identifies as a lesbian, me among them. And there was a comedian, and this comedian was incredibly transphobic. Like it was awful. Like it was awful. I won't repeat anything that she said, but it was awful. And everyone was kind of like, you know where you are, like read the room. And there were trans women there. And it was terrible. She got cut short. And then after that, she was kind of like ranting about the fact that people had a problem with her, and she was going on and on. It was awful. She was clearly in a lot of pain. You could see she was hurting deeply. And I was so angry just at what was going on. And I was like, I can't believe I'm supposed to be like with some of my people and this is still going on. And then I went through this whole process where I was angry because I felt like I thought I should have been in a quote unquote safe space right? Because it was my people. And then this happened. And then I was angry at myself for being angry, because I do think that we should have intervened and given this woman some support. Not that we shouldn't hold her accountable for what she said, but she was clearly in pain, and she was among quote unquote family. So there should have been some intervention that didn't happen. And I thought about all of this, and then realizing, like, you can be in among your people, right? Whoever you identify as your people. And if you aren't safe inside yourself, there is no safety.
Right.
And I had to remind myself of that in that moment. And that grounded, like, I grounded myself, and I was breathing even though I was angry, and I was acknowledging that I was angry. I was furious, and feeling my feet and breathing and telling myself that it was okay, because I just felt like hella triggered and hella protective of the trans women who were there, my trans siblings who, were being attacked essentially. And I say all that to say is that you have to find it inside yourself, because you can't manipulate the external world to be what you need it to be.
Right. That's perfect. End of story.
End of story.
End of podcast. All right, guys, we will talk to you later.